An English Canadian or Anglo-Canadian refers to either a Canadian of English ethnic origin and heritage, or to an English-speaking, or Anglophone, Canadian of any ethnic origin. It is used primarily in contrast with French Canadian. Canada is an officially bilingual state, with English and French official language communities. Immigrant cultural groups ostensibly integrate into one or both of these communities, but often retaining elements of their original cultures. The term English-speaking Canadian is sometimes used interchangeably with English Canadian. Although many English-speaking Canadians have strong historical roots traceable to England or other parts of the British Isles, the population as whole belongs to a multitude of ethnic backgrounds. They or their ancestors came from various European, Asian, Caribbean, African, Latin American, and Pacific Island cultures, as well as French Canada and North American Aboriginal groups. As such, although the office of the Governor-General is said to alternate between French and English persons, the two most recent former Governors-General show that this refers to language and not culture or ethnicity. In addition to the terms English Canadian and Canadian, the terms Anglophone Canadian and Anglo-Canadian are also used. Geographic distribution. The following table shows the English-speaking population of Canada's provinces and territories. The data are from Statistics Canada. Figures are given for the number of single responses, English, to the mother tongue question, as well as a total including multiple responses, one of which is English. Notably, 46% of English-speaking Canadians live in Ontario, and 30% in the two western provinces of British Columbia and Alberta. The most monolingual province is Newfoundland and Labrador at 98.5%. English speakers are in the minority only in Quebec and Nunavut. In the cases of Quebec and New Brunswick, the vast majority of the non-Anglophone population speaks French. In the case of Nunavut, the people speak a non-official language of Canada. Inuktitut. History. Newfoundland English-Canadian history starts with the attempts to establish English settlements in Newfoundland in the 17th century. The first English settlement in present-day Canada was at St. John's, Newfoundland, in 1583. Newfoundland's population was significantly influenced by Irish and English immigration, much of it as a result of the migratory fishery in the decades prior to the Irish potato famine. Although the location of the earliest English settlement in what would eventually become Canada, Newfoundland itself would be the last province to enter Confederation in 1949. Nova Scotia. The area that forms the present-day province of Nova Scotia was contested by the British and French in the 18th century. French settlements at Port Royal, Louisbourg and what is now Prince Edward Island were seized by the British. After the 1713 Treaty of Utrecht ceded the French colony of Acadia to Great Britain, efforts to colonize the province were limited to small settlements in Cancer and Annapolis Royal. In 1749, Colonel Edward Cornwallis was given command of an expedition for the settlement of Chebucto by some 3,000 persons, many of whom were Cockney. Cornwallis's settlement, Halifax, would become the provincial capital, the primary commercial centre for the maritime provinces, a strategic British military and naval outpost and an important East Coast cultural centre. To offset the Catholic presence of Acadians, foreign Protestants were given land and founded Lunenburg. Nova Scotia itself saw considerable immigration from Scotland, particularly to communities such as Pictou in the northern part of the province and to Cape Breton Island. But this began only with the arrival of the Hector in 1773. Loyalists. New Brunswick, Quebec and Ontario. The history of English Canadians is bound to the history of English settlement of North America. Many of the 50,000 Loyalists who were resettled to the north of the United States after 1783 came from families that had already been settled for several generations in North America and were from prominent families in Boston, New York and other East Coast towns. Although largely of British ancestry, these settlers had also intermarried with Huguenot and Dutch colonists and were accompanied by loyalists of African descent, dispossessed of their property at the end of the Revolutionary War. The Loyalists arrived as refugees to settle primarily along the shores of southern Nova Scotia, the Bay of Fundy and the St. John River, and in Quebec to the east and southwest of Montreal. The colony of New Brunswick was created from western part of Nova Scotia at the instigation of these new English-speaking settlers. The Loyalist settlements in southwestern Quebec formed the nucleus of what would become the province of Upper Canada and, after 1867, Ontario. Ontario Upper Canada was a primary destination for English, Scottish and Scots-Irish settlers to Canada in the 19th century, and was on the front lines in the War of 1812 between the British Empire and the United States. The province also received immigrants from non-English-speaking sources such as Germans, many of whom settled around Kitchener. Ontario would become the most populous province in the Dominion of Canada at the time of Confederation, and, together with Montreal, formed the country's industrial heartland and emerged as an important cultural and media centre for English Canada. Toronto is today the largest city in Canada, and, largely as a result of changing immigration patterns since the 1960s, is also one of the most multicultural cities in the world. Quebec. After the fall of New France to the British in 1759, a colonial governing class established itself in Quebec City. Larger numbers of English-speaking settlers arrived in the eastern townships and Montreal after the American Revolution. English, Scottish, and Irish communities established themselves in Montreal in the 1800s. Montreal would become Canada's largest city and commercial hub in Canada. An Anglo-Scot business elite would control Canadian commerce up until the 1950s, founding a Protestant public school system and hospitals and universities such as McGill University. These immigrants were joined by other Europeans in the early 1900s, including Italians and Jews, who assimilated to a large degree into the Anglophone community. Many English-speaking Quebecers left Quebec following the election of the parti COIs in 1976, resulting in a steep decline in the Anglophone population. Many who have remained have learned French in order to function within the dominant Francophone society. British Columbia is in much of Western Canada. Many of the earliest European communities in British Columbia began as outposts of the Hudson's Bay Company, founded in London in 1670 to carry on the fur trade via Hudson Bay. The capital, Victoria, developed during the height of the British Empire, and long self-identified as being more English than the English. The colony of British Columbia was established on the mainland in 1858 by Governor James Douglas as a means of asserting British sovereignty in the face of a massive influx of gold miners, many of whom were American. Despite the enormous distances that separated the Pacific colony from central Canada, British Columbia joined Confederation in 1871. Choosing to become Canadian partly as a means of resisting possible absorption into the United States. Chinese workers, brought into labor on the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway, established sizable populations in many BC communities, particularly Vancouver, which quickly became the province's economic and cultural centre after the railway's completion in 1886. Like Ontario, British Columbia has received immigrants from a broad range of countries including large numbers of Germans, Scandinavians, Italians, Sikhs from India and Chinese from Hong Kong, Taiwan and in more recent years, the People's Republic, and the ongoing influx of Europeans from Europe continues. However, for many years British Columbia, in contrast to the prairie provinces, received a majority of immigrants from Great Britain, over half in 1911 and over 60% by 1921. Over half of people with British ancestry in British Columbia have direct family ties within 2 generations to the British Isles. rather than via British ethnic stock from central Canada or the Maritimes. Europeans of non-British stock have been more common, also, in British Columbia than in any other part of Canada, although certain ethnicities such as Ukrainians and Scandinavians are more concentrated in the prairies. Except for the Italians and more recent European immigrants, earlier waves of Europeans of all origins are near entirely assimilated. Interethnic and interracial marriages and were also more common in British Columbia than in other provinces since colonial times. Manitoba, Saskatchewan and Alberta. The French-English tensions that marked the establishment of the earliest English-speaking settlements in Nova Scotia were echoed on the prairies in the late 19th century. The earliest British settlement in Assiniboia involved some 300 largely Scottish colonists under the sponsorship of Lord Selkirk in 1811. The early attempts at introducing English-speaking settlers into an area already occupied by French-speaking Emirs sparked the Red River Rebellion, and the later Northwest Rebellion. These conflicts created a rift between Ontario and Quebec. The suppression of the rebellions allowed the Government of Canada to proceed with the settlement of Manitoba, Saskatchewan and Alberta that was to create provinces that identified generally with English Canada in culture and outlook. Although immigration included large numbers of people from non-English-speaking European backgrounds, especially Scandinavians and Ukrainians. Nunavut 20th century. Although Canada has long prided itself on its relatively peaceful history, war has played a significant role in the formation of an English-Canadian identity. As part of the British Empire, Canada found itself at war against the Central Powers in 1914. In the main, English Canadians enlisted for service with an initial enthusiastic and genuine sense of loyalty and duty. The sacrifices and accomplishments of Canadians at battles such as Vimy Ridge and the Jep Raid in France are well known and respected among English Canadians and helped forge a more common sense of nationality. In World War II, Canada made its own separate declaration of war and played a critical role in supporting the Allied war effort. Again, support for the war effort to defend the United Kingdom and liberate continental Europe from Axis domination was particularly strong among English Canadians. In the post-war era, although Canada was committed to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, English Canadians took considerable pride in the Nobel Prize for Peace awarded to Lester Pearson for his role in resolving the Suez Crisis and have been determined supporters of the peacekeeping activities of the United Nations. In the late 20th century, increasing American cultural influence combined with diminishing British influence, and political and constitutional crises driven by the exigencies of dealing with the Quebec sovereignty movement and Western alienation contributed to something of an identity crisis for English Canadians. George Grant's Lament for a Nation is still seen as an important work relating to the stresses and vulnerabilities affecting English Canada. However, the period of the 1960s through to the present have also seen tremendous accomplishments in English Canadian literature. Writers from English-speaking Canada such as Margaret Atwood, Mordecai Richler, Margaret Lawrence, Robertson Davies, Timothy Findlay, and Carol Shields dissected the experience of English Canadians. The historical relevance of the beaver stems from the early fur trade. It has been asserted that the fur trade in general and the Hudson's Bay Company in particular exercised a profound influence on the sculpting of the Canadian soul. The crown has historically been an intangible but significant symbol for many English Canadians. Loyalty to Great Britain created the initial fracture lines between the populations of the 13 colonies and the populations of Nova Scotia and Quebec at the time of the American Revolution and forced the flight of the Loyalists after the end of the war. As such, English Canada developed in the 19th century along lines that continued to emphasize this historical attachment, evident in the naming of cities, parks and even whole provinces after members of the royal family, the retention of flags, badges and provincial mottos expressive of loyalty, and enthusiastic responses to royal visits. While such loyalty is no longer as powerful a unifying force as it once was among English Canadians, it continues to exert a noticeable influence on English Canadian culture. According to the author and political commentator Richard Gwyn, while the British connection has long vanished, it takes only a short dig down to the sedimentary layer once occupied by the Loyalists to locate the sources of a great many contemporary Canadian convictions and conventions. Gwyn considers that the modern equivalent of the once talismanic loyalty is tolerance, a quality now accepted almost universally as the feature that makes us a distinct people. Ethnic composition. The 2001 Census of Canada provides information about the ethnic composition of English-speaking Canadians. This refers to the ethnic or cultural group to which the respondents' ancestors belong. However, interpretation of data is complicated by two factors. Respondents were instructed to specify as many ethnic origins as applicable. Thus, if one has 7 great-grandparents of English descent and one of Welsh descent, one will answer English and Welsh to this question. And in this example, the representation of Welsh ancestry is exaggerated. This method is likely to lead to overrepresentation of smaller groups compared to the method in use until 1976. In which only paternal ancestry was reported. If on the other hand one restricts attention to single responses, groups which have arrived in Canada more recently will be overrepresented compared to groups which have been present longer. Non-Aboriginal respondents are not discouraged from providing responses denoting origins in North America. The most frequent of these is Canadian. The response, Canadian, is in fact provided as an example in the census instructions, based on its frequency in past surveys. See the definition of ethnic origin from the 2001 Census Dictionary for further information. The data in the following tables pertain to the population of Canada reporting English as its sole mother tongue. A total of 17,352,315 inhabitants out of 29,639,035. A figure for single ethnic origin responses is provided, as well as a total figure for ethnic origins appearing in single or multiple responses. The sum of the percentages for single responses is less than 100%, while the corresponding total for single or multiple responses is greater than 100%. The data are taken from the 2001 Census of Canada. The remaining ethnic groups forming at least 1% of the English-speaking population are Welsh, Swedish, Hungarian, East Indian, MEAQTIs, Jewish, Russian, American, Jamaican and Chinese. The remaining ethnic groups forming at least 0.5% of the English-speaking population are East Indian, Jamaican and Chinese. Depending on the principal period of immigration to Canada and other factors, ethnic groups vary in the percentage of native speakers of English. For example, while a roughly equal number of Canadians have at least partial Ukrainian and Chinese ancestry, 82% of Ukrainian Canadians speak English as their sole mother tongue, and only 17% of Chinese Canadians do. As the number of second and third generation Chinese Canadians increases, their weight within the English-speaking population can also be expected to increase. It should also be borne in mind that some percentage of any minority ethnic group will adopt French, particularly in Quebec.